Good evening. Thank you all for joining us and watching Hunger Ward, an extremely timely and important documentary. I'm Liebe Geft, the director of the Museum of Tolerance. As the film showed us in a vivid and compelling way, Yemen is facing the world's most urgent and devastating humanitarian crisis, and critical action is needed now to avert a large-scale famine. Hunger Ward is the third film in a trilogy of films on the global refugee crisis by renowned director Skye Fitzgerald. In 2015, Fitzgerald and his team produced 50 Feet from Syria, focused on doctors working on the Syrian border. The second film, Lifeboat, documents search and rescue operations off the coast of Libya. The Museum of Tolerance had the privilege of showing Lifeboat, which was nominated for the Academy Award. Together with Hunger Ward, this humanitarian trilogy puts a human face on the crises people have created in our time. The unflinching portraits of Dr. Aida Al-Sadiq and nurse Mekia Mahdi reveal their deep commitment as they work to save the lives of hunger-stricken children within a population on the brink of famine. We trust these films to generate empathy and jar us out of complacency. We're most grateful to MTV Documentary Films for partnering with us to offer tonight's special screening of Hunger Ward, and we'd especially like to thank Sheila Nevins and Liza Burnett Pfefferman. Thank you to David Magdal and Vince Johnson at David Magdal and Associates, and to Adam Siegel and the 2050 Group for making tonight's program possible. And now we have the special opportunity to meet the director of Hunger Ward, Skye Fitzgerald, joined by Dr. Aisha Jumaan, president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. They will engage in a conversation and Q&A moderated by acclaimed filmmaker Mark Jonathan Harris. You're welcome to post your questions in the Q&A option on your screens. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, who directed the Academy Award-winning documentary The Long Way Home with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Mark Jonathan Harris.
Thank you. It's an honor to be back here. 2 years ago, we were here with Skye's film, Lifeboat, and now he's returned with perhaps the most powerful and haunting of the three films that he did in what he calls his humanitarian trilogy. All three films have been nominated, been on the short list for the Academy, for Academy Award for short documentary. And last year, Lifeboat was nominated for Oscar for short documentary. These films are all about distant crises that many of us are only vaguely aware of. They bear powerful witness to war and the impact of war and civil war particularly, and crises that we only experience peripherally on the news. So I want to begin by asking, Skye, what draws you to these conflicts and war zones? What keeps you making these kinds of harrowing films?
Well, let's just start off with the tough stuff, Mark. That's an excellent question. I think for me, it was more a matter of how I could not do this film. How could I turn away from the fact that hundreds of thousands of children were on the brink of dying from hunger, and right in front of us as a global community, and not somehow try to intervene in my own small way. I think I think I don't want to sound over religious in my approach as a filmmaker, because I'm not. I have a deep faith, but I'm also secular in other ways, and I felt called to do this film. I felt like it was something that I must do, that I had to do, and I just tried to listen to that when that comes. And so, for me, when that happens, it doesn't matter, how difficult a subject may be. I feel like it's something I have to respond to, and I think I marry that with the idea that, or the belief that, sometimes I think it's the hard films that we ought to do, right? The harder a subject is, the more difficult it is to access, the more challenging it is to do it well. Maybe those are the ones that are worth our time on this planet. Maybe those are the ones that we ought to spend some time investing in.
Well, I want to come back to that and in a moment, but I think for many people, the war in Yemen is something that we know very little about. And I'll speak for myself. I know that there's a civil war in Yemen, and that on one side are Saudi line troops, and then the other side are Iranian. And that's about, before I saw your film, to be honest, that was all that I knew about it. And I think the audience needs some background. Aisha, I want to get your reaction to the film, but maybe you could explain to the audience what this conflict is about, how we got into it, and what's America's role in this conflict.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'll start about the film, and then I'll move into why we are in this disastrous situation right now. My reaction to the film was haunting. I've had so many repressed emotions about what's going on in Yemen because I need to carry out my life. I need to do the advocacy that I'm doing. And the movie just brought all those emotions out. The people that you saw and the audience saw are people that, if I don't know them personally, I know people who look like them. I have family members that look like them. I know friends who've lost everything in this war. And so it was very hard to watch. And it was hard also because as an American also, that we have contributed to this was very challenging for me. So again, like you said, it's a haunting movie. And in a way, it was kind of therapeutic for me because I needed to get those emotions out. I needed to cry and cry hard because in the beginning, that was hard for me to do.
You also work as an epidemiologist, and that you work in this area of with children and about children's health issues. So this must be particularly hard to see the devastation that this famine has brought.
It's hard, as you said, as an epidemiologist. I've done a lot of nutritional surveys from Yemen to Peru. And for me, what it means, other than the immediate death for a lot of these children, is the long-term impact, not just on the children, but also on the families. A lot of these kids are not going to develop cognitively well. And so we're going to need to deal with this for many, many years to come. The other things is the mental health status of not just the children, but also the families. I'm always reminded of the story of Moses and his mom when she had to put him in the river. And in the Quran, it says that Moses' mom's heart became devoid or void. That's the hardest thing for a parent, to lose a child. And so that's something that we're going to need to deal with in Yemen, is the mental health of the population, a whole population, 30 million people. But going back to your question about the conflict, Yemen, like many other countries in the region in 2011, were very excited, the population, about the Arab Spring. We're going to change to more democratically elected governments. That didn't go as smoothly, but at least up to November 2011, there were no war, and there was a peaceful transition of power from Saleh to Hadi, who was his vice president, for a 2-year term. And then there was a national dialogue for almost a year that brought all the Yemeni factions and parties into the table. However, two groups did not feel that they were represented well in the national dialogue. One was the Houthi, or Ansar Allah, and the other one, the separatist movement in the south. In the fall of 2014, protests in Yemen started again over corruption and increased fuel prices. The Houthi at that point in time took the opportunity and marched into Sana'a and took control. There was a UN envoy in Yemen at that part in time, and they signed an agreement for a unity government. And that was about September of 2014. In January and February, Hadi resigned from the government, and he fled to Aden and then withdrew his resignation. The Houthi followed him to Aden. In March 2015, the UN envoy to Yemen, Jamal bin Omar, announced that there is a new power sharing deal that was supposed to be signed in Riyadh. And that's when the Saudi-led coalition started the airstrikes in Yemen. And that was March 2015.
Okay, that's a background. We'll come back to the United States involvement in this and their role in this war. But I want to go back to Skye. So making this film, it's watching children starve to death is very difficult, a painful experience, I think, to film. It's certainly because it's certainly a painful experience to see on the screen. I mean, your film begins with a death and ends with a death. And so I wondered, as you're constructing the film, how were you thinking, how do I keep the audience engaged watching this? What can I offer them to keep them watching such difficult circumstances, keep them from turning away?
Yeah, Mark, you've really, I think, hit upon, one of the central tensions that we had in doing this film, right? Because you're right, it's hard to watch a child die in front of you, whether you're a viewer or holding the camera. And you know what? It ought to be. And I believe that one of my jobs as a filmmaker is not to flinch. I believe that part of my job is to honor the experience of those we're in the room with, who have invited us into the room, so that we can document what they're going through, and to help others understand on sort of a visceral level what it's like to lose your child to starvation, to try to build empathy for them and their situation. And in this case, I think also to help a viewer in America, for example, to understand that we are complicit, right? We as Americans, I think, we tend to shy away from death and dying in general. And I guess I've just always been a deep believer that I think if we're willing to face it head on, that we as a society may be better at grieving and better at sort of coming to terms with what is ultimately a natural part of life, right? Death. But that tension that we faced on a daily basis was very real, because we didn't want people to turn away. We wanted people to be able to bear witness with us. And one of the ways that I tried to achieve that as a filmmaker was through the power of directness, right? And simplicity, of not looking away with the camera, but also not cutting away, right? Not making an edit that would then allow the viewer to look away. And so, you know, one of my goals in this film and in the entire trilogy actually has been to try to create a sense of immersiveness by holding shots as long as we can as something is unfolding, very verite style. And so I was a little disappointed in this film that we didn't actually achieve at any point an actual like 90-second shot. Because I found there's a sweet spot around 90 seconds where you can really craft an internal narrative within a shot sometimes. And we got to like 78 seconds, 80 seconds multiple times in this film because something really happens when you don't cut away and when you don't turn away. And so that was one of the principles that we used was immersiveness through really looking but allowing the viewer to understand by bearing witness and not editing.
You know, I think in the final scene where you move away from the child's death and concentrate on the, I guess it's a woman who works at the hospital in her grief, and you spend a long time just sharing that grief with her. I think that's provides the audience a kind of opportunity to grieve with her. I thought that was extremely well done. But you also, I mean, there are two girls in the film who are both quite beautiful, who are suffering from malnutrition. Abir and Omaima, if I'm pronouncing that right. And both of them bring some light and some sense of hope to the film. Abir particularly is just a beautiful child, and the nurse's attempt to get her to smile is so wonderful. Because then when she does smile, like her face lights up. I thought that those two subjects sort of offset the deaths, the difficulty, you know, frankly, watching children starve to death. And we see the grief of the parents, but that's the most difficult thing, I think, for any parent is to lose a child, especially under those conditions.
Yeah, there's a joy and a hope in children, right? You know, and even though we witness children pass, which is just grievous in nature, I really believe that, you know, it's a little trite, but children are our future, right? Globally, in any country in the world, in every country in the world. And so we were also looking for hope, right? We were also looking for the opportunity for hope in what's really an invisible war and the invisible work of these doctors and nurses who are doing incredible things to save lives on a daily basis, but very few people know about. And Abir and Omaima, who you mentioned, they're both success stories. Both of those girls right now are thriving in great part because of the work of Nurse Makia and Dr. Al-Sadiq. And, you know, I didn't want that to get lost, right? I didn't want this film just to be a requiem. I wanted it to also be sort of like, you know, a beam of light, you know, to showcase even under these incredibly difficult circumstances, these wonderful human beings who are doing really great work to save lives.
Great. Aisha, you know, you're part of the Yemen diaspora. You know, you've worked in Yemen, you grew up in Yemen, you're seeing all this happen from the distance of someone living in the United States. How has this film affected you, or how have you responded to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen? And what is it that you think that more Americans can do?
Yeah. So you're right. Although I was away and not in Yemen, the bombing was daily. You know, For example, my parents' neighborhood was bombed daily for months, and the largest bomb was in their neighborhood. For the first few months, I couldn't sleep for night. I was always afraid I'd wake up the next morning and my family would not be there because there were so many indiscriminate airstrikes. We have relatives who are adult with their brothers and sisters who had their own building with apartments where the family lived. That building was hit by airstrikes, and everybody in that family died. And there were 4 homes, except one young man who was with my nephew, visiting my nephew at that time. And there are so many other stories that are like that. So it's been, I was in disbelief, first of all, that this war even started, and was also quite upset that the Obama administration agreed to support it at the time. My first reaction, knowing the situation in Yemen, the economy in Yemen, was to start sending money to a lot of the network that I work with in Yemen to support families in need. So I used my own funding to do that. And then I started writing editorials, to increase awareness about what's going on in Yemen. I established Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation with the mission of increasing awareness, not just among the public, but also among our policymakers, and to try and facilitate peace efforts. So it's been, from day one of the war, when it was announced, I've been actively trying to get people to know about it and rally people to let our government, the US government, do its job of supporting stopping it. I think the Biden administration have been given a very rare chance to correct something that they did wrong in the first administration. And I hope that they do take it and they do act to support a peaceful resolution to the war in Yemen. A lot of people call the Yemen war as a civil war, and I'm one who disagrees with that, because if we have a Saudi-led coalition with 37 countries who are providing them arms, I don't think that's a civil war any longer. And as you mentioned, Iran is also supporting the Houthis. So I don't, it's become more of a regional war with international support.
And we have provided a tactical and intelligence support to the Saudis, right? That's America's involvement in this war. One of the questions, Skye, from people in the audience, and it's a question that I want to ask too, is how did you gain access to to Yemen? I mean, how did you find the doctors in your film? And part of that question, I guess, is also what people are wondering. When did you first become aware of Yemen? And you said you felt called to go there. So when did you become aware of this? And then once you did, how do you proceed to gain access to a country in which you're not a native, a country it's in the midst of war? How do you do this safely? There are a lot of considerations. You're going, considerations for you, safety for you, your crew, but also you're looked on as a foreigner and a representative of America. For some people, you're the enemy.
Yeah, all good questions. All good questions. The entire trilogy started as sort of what I intended to be a loose exploration of displacement, right? Because I've seen, the global refugee crisis as this burgeoning global crisis that we haven't dealt with well as a global community. 80 million human beings on this planet nearly, aren't living in their home. They are displaced either as refugees, asylum seekers, or IDPs, internally displaced people. That's a horrifically high number, right? That's like, I think 1% of the world's population, if you do the math. That's something that we need to look at. And so loosely, that was how the trilogy began for me. And so I learned about Yemen as part of my due diligence as I was completing Lifeboat, because as the EU shut down the border to southern Europe to asylum seekers trying to cross the Mediterranean, the refugee flow really shifted, right? And it shifted across the Red Sea into Yemen, onto the west coast of Yemen, and that traffic to this day travels up the west coast of Yemen to the Saudi border. And so that's how it sort of first landed on my radar. But the more I talked to colleagues, the more that I did research and learned about the vast number of IDPs within the borders of Yemen, and how the blockade over the country was creating a human caused famine that was completely preventable. I was shocked, dismayed, and horrified, right? Horrified not only that it was occurring, but that our own country was funding it operationally as well as financially. And so that sort of lit my fuse a bit. And that's what got me doing deep research into it. I talked to many colleagues who eventually led me to Makia and Dr. Al-Sadiq, and then started, about a year-long work to build relationships with them long before we gained access to the country.
The film focuses on the doctor and the nurse in two different hospitals, but in the center of the film, there's also this remarkable interview with someone who survived the air attack and destruction at, I guess, a wedding, not a memorial service. And you move away from the kids and the starvation to see the overall devastation. Can you talk about how you got that remarkable footage of, I guess that cell phone footage taken right at the time of the bombing, and why you put that in the center of the film?
Yeah, well, so the risks were very real for us while filming this. It's a conflict zone, and so we had to make a lot of choices that would mitigate that risk for our partners in country as well as for ourselves. And so one of the ways we did that was that we shaped the narrative of the film within the confines of these two really respected clinics and hospitals, to both protect our collaborators, because it's very dangerous for people to work with any form of media in country, but also to protect ourselves, right? When we traveled to the north, because part of our story happens in the south and part in the north, which are held by different groups, the first thing you see when you start to cross over into Northern Territory are slogans everywhere, on rocks, on the sides of buildings, on vehicles. And, part of that slogan that Ansar Allah uses as mostly propaganda in the country is death to America, right? And it's everywhere. And so the entire period that we were functioning in the North, we were facing that on a moment-to-moment basis, which, it wakes you up in the morning, right? And we had to operate very carefully. So that was part of the context that we were working in. But in terms of the airstrikes, that was a very conscious choice on my part to move outside of the walls of these clinics where so much story happens, and to provide sort of a visual experience and visceral experience for the viewer of what it's like in northern Yemen for people who have been experiencing this barrage of airstrikes for 6 years, right? The instance that you referenced happened in October of 2016. It was a memorial service. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there. Over 500 people were injured ultimately, but it was a memorial service that was triple tapped by the Saudi coalition, and killed over 140 people, innocent people who were attending this memorial service. And I felt like rather than, go to a slate that shows, or card that shows, the stats, what I want to try to do is immerse the viewer for a moment in what it's like to be there, a victim and a witness and a survivor of an airstrike. So it's the only moment in the film where we used any footage that wasn't original, was something that we didn't film. And the footage we used was, again, cell phone footage from Ali Al-Aqwa, who was a singer who was hired to sing at this memorial service, who survived. And he had the wherewithal to pull out his cell phone after the first missile strike and just do basically a 270 around him to show the people dead and dying around him, and then to selfie himself as proof, right? To bear witness himself that he was there and he survived and this just occurred. And we don't cut that clip again, Mark. That clip just rolls unedited.
Well, that's remarkable, footage. To return to the children who are suffering malnutrition and starvation, one of the questions from the audience is, how do you treat malnutrition? And this is a question probably for Aisha. What do you do to stop that malnutrition? And at what point is it too late? I mean, I thought one of the things in the film that was just a moment when the father says that he sold all his, I guess it's his sheep. He's done everything he could to be able to feed his child, and he still has he is not capable of doing it. And the nurse gives him some money to go and buy something. I thought that was an instance of both the difficulty and her humanity. But can you talk about how you treat malnutrition and what you can do to stop it, other than bringing food in? And why can't we bring in the humanitarian aid?
So when a child is malnourished and severely malnourished, basically they're not able to eat our regular food. They have to have special food because they're not able to digest the food correctly. And so there are specially made food for severely malnourished children, and those have to be brought in from Yemen. And by the way, Yemen imports 90% of its food from overseas. So like Skye mentioned, the blockade limits how much food gets in. It's also impacted the economy big time. So a lot of people don't have money to be able to buy the food when it's available in the market. In terms of aid agencies, the numbers are staggering. I mean, you're talking about 16.2 million today who are at risk of famine. And there are always cuts to UN and humanitarian agencies. So they're not able to reach everyone. And Yemen, which a lot of people don't realize, is also very mountainous. There are regions in Yemen that are mountainous. And there are a lot of settlements that are in the mountains that are very hard to reach. It may take 16 to 18 hours to drive to these places. These are the places for us as Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation that we're able to work in, because we work with volunteers from these regions. So UN agencies or international agencies cannot go to these places. First of all, it's very expensive for them to get to these places. They need permission to get to these places. And also, they need security for them to get to a lot of these places. So it's very, and Aden is actually an easy access. I know where the shooting, where Makia worked, that's another place that was actually closed out for fighting and security reasons. So there are a lot of hurdles for international agencies to be able to get to the people who are in need. That's why the UN just March 1st called in for pledging, for countries to pledge into the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Unfortunately, not enough countries pledged, including, and here I will specifically mention the US, the Saudi, and the Emiratis, who have contributed to the crisis in Yemen. And I think they should contribute their fair share to help a lot of these children and avert famine. Mark Lowcock said, if we allow Yemen to fall into famine, we would not have seen something like this in over 40 years. And like you said, this is man-made and this is preventable.
You know, when people watch this film, people are moved by the plight of the children. I think, and it's not surprising that the audience and viewers want to know two things. One is, what can they do? And two, what can the United States do to, and what should the United States do to facilitate the end of this war? So I'm going to ask both of you that question. Maybe we'll start with Skye. I mean, because the film really is it's a call to action. Certainly the title's at the end. I call those people who have been moved by this film to try to, you know, once you say you were called to make this film, I think once people have seen it, they're also called to act on what they've seen. You've borne witness, and now we share that witness. So what can we do? What should we do? Well,
I'm going to let Aisha deal with the political action, because there's a lot to talk about there. From a, you know, from a concrete action standpoint, I would lead people directly to our website for the film, which is hungerward.org. And there we've listed ways that people can get directly involved. They include, but aren't complete, there's a legislative tool to directly contact senators and Congress people to engage the Biden administration and Congress directly to intervene in all the things Aisha is about to talk about. There are links to organizations that are doing absolutely fundamentally important work in the country. Friends Committee for National Legislation, the Quaker group out of DC, is doing a lot of legislative action. There's a link to Aisha's foundation, the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, which is actively working with at least one of the clinics that we show in the film to provide food baskets. So there's lots of different concrete ways. And then we also, as a small film team, have actually created the agency as a small team where folks can donate directly to the two clinics that we showcase. And we've worked out a really delicate way where funds donated there go directly to the two clinics that you just watched. I would want to say one more thing, and that's just that, you know, Article 14th of the Geneva Convention, you know, explicitly states that starvation as a tool in combat is prohibited, and that it is a war crime to take any action as a warring party that causes starvation. And the famine in Yemen, right, is a war crime that's being perpetuated today with our tax dollars. So go out, do research, connect with these organizations so that we can stop it. Okay, and for those people, they could check the chat, because in the chat are the links to some of the organizations you mentioned, right? Yeah. Okay, Aisha, from your perspective, what can people do when if they're moved by this film?
I think call on the White House, call on the State Department, call on our representatives and our senators. The number one I've been working on since day one is to end the blockade, because I believe the blockade is the reason we have the famine in Yemen. I will compare the situation in Yemen right now economically to the COVID-19 economy. When we had to shut down for COVID-19, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their businesses. A lot of people lost the ability to pay rent for their homes. Yemen has been living that COVID-19 economy for 6 years now. So I will call on our administration to pressure the Saudis to end the blockade as a first step, so people can help themselves. We've seen that when UN agencies call for help with funding, people don't step to the plate. So at least allow them to rehabilitate and restart, energizing their economy and helping themselves. That would be the first one I would ask for. The second one is there is a UN resolution that was introduced in 2015. It's called UN Security Council Resolution 2216. That is one-sided. It was actually written by the Saudis, and the US government unfortunately supported it, thinking that the Russians are going to veto it like they do with a lot of Syria votes. But the Saudis promised the Russians they would buy weapons from them. The resolution passed. The resolution does not allow for a peaceful negotiation in Yemen. And there are a lot of experts, including US government experts, who are calling now for a revision of that resolution. So it will be a fair resolution, including Jeffrey Feldman from the Brookings Institute, including Nabil Khouri. These are all diplomats who had worked in the region. So we need to do that. And then we need to support a peaceful resolution that is inclusive, where we don't exclude anyone in this. And I wish also for the administration to de-link their negotiation on the nuclear deal with Iran from Yemen. Yet the Yemeni people should not be held hostage to the negotiation over the Iran deal. We have nothing to do with it. The Yemeni have nothing to do with it. The Obama administration supported the Saudi so they can support the Iran deal to start with. And I would love for everybody to call for a de-linking. The Yemeni people should not be sacrificed for a conflict between the US and Iran.
Well, I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Skye, for the film. Thank you, Aisha, for your work on behalf of on behalf of Yemen, and particularly on behalf of the children. It is very painful to see the most vulnerable of our population suffering in this way. I think everyone who has seen this film can no longer say they don't know what's happening in Yemen. And for bearing witness to this, I think that this is traditionally what documentary filmmakers do. They go to bear witness to our problems and give us access to places we would never otherwise go. But Skye, my congratulations to you for the work that you've been consistently doing to bring our attention to conflicts that we would rather not see. So thank you both very much, and thank you to the museum for hosting this tonight.
Thank you, Mark. It's been my honor to be here, and thank you as well, Aisha.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Skye and Mark, and the museum.